Imagine a vibrant city on the edge of the Mediterranean, where the scent of sea salt mingles with the clang of forges and the murmurs of merchants. We are in Carthage in the year 247 before Christ, a commercial power that, despite its wealth, carries the scars of a recent defeat. It is in this setting that Hannibal Barca is born, the firstborn son of Hamilcar Barca, a general both revered and feared, whose life was dedicated to the glory of Carthage. The First Punic War, which had ended only 6 years earlier, in 241 before Christ, had left deep wounds. The Carthaginian fleet, once sovereign, had been humiliated by Rome, and valuable territories, such as Sicily, had been torn away from their hands. It is in this cauldron of wounded pride and ambition that young Hannibal opens his eyes to the world. The childhood of Hannibal was not like that of other children. While boys of his age played in the streets of Carthage, he grew up surrounded by the weight of responsibility and the shadow of war. His father, Hamilcar, was not only a military leader, but a man consumed by a burning desire to restore the honor of Carthage. It is said that at home, conversations did not revolve around childhood tales, but around strategies, maps, and accounts of battles lost against Rome. Hannibal, with attentive eyes and a sharp mind, absorbed every word. He was not simply the son of a general. He was the heir to a mission. Around the year 238 before Christ, when Hannibal was only 9 years old, his life changed forever. Hamilcar, determined to rebuild Carthaginian power, departed for Hispania, present-day Spain, a land rich in silver, gold, and fierce warriors. But he did not go alone. He took young Hannibal with him, tearing him away from the comfort of Carthage and plunging him into the harsh world of military camps. Imagine a 9-year-old boy, small before bronze-skinned soldiers and gleaming spears, walking among tents under the scorching sun of the Iberian Peninsula. There, amid the clash of swords and the neighing of horses, Hannibal began to learn the art of war. He observed his father negotiate with local tribes, plan ambushes, and command men with an authority that inspired absolute loyalty. For Hannibal, this was not just a battlefield. It was a classroom. It was in this environment that the moment which would define his life took place. According to the historians Polybius and Livy, whose pens captured Hannibal's saga centuries later, Hamilcar took his son to a temple in Hispania. The air was heavy with the smell of incense and the heat of flames rising from a ceremonial altar. Before a crowd of warriors and priests, Hamilcar asked Hannibal to take a solemn oath. The boy, with the courage of one who does not yet know the full weight of his words, placed his hand upon the altar, where the blood of a sacrifice was still fresh, and promised he would never be a friend to Rome. This oath was not merely a promise, it was a pact engraved upon his soul, a fire that would burn for the rest of his life. At the age of 9, Hannibal Barca declared war upon the greatest empire in the world. Hispania became the stage upon which Hannibal grew. He did not simply accompany his father, but lived among the soldiers, learning to ride horses, wield a sword, and understand the complex alliances with Iberian tribes. Hamilcar expanded Carthaginian dominion, conquering cities and mines to finance a future confrontation with Rome. Hannibal, still a child, witnessed it all: the victories, the negotiations, and even the defeats. Each lesson shaped his strategic mind, preparing him for a destiny he himself did not yet fully comprehend. When Hamilcar died in 228 before Christ, drowned in a river during a battle, Hannibal, then 19 years old, already bore the weight of a legacy. He was no longer merely a boy from Carthage. He was the heir to a vengeance. In the year 228 before Christ, Hispania, a land of rugged mountains, wild rivers, and fierce tribes, became the stage of a young man destined to challenge the greatest empire in the world. Hannibal Barca, only 19 years old, saw his world change when his father, the legendary general Hamilcar Barca, fell in battle, drowned in the turbulent waters of a river, while fighting against rebellious tribes. The death of Hamilcar was not merely a personal loss for Hannibal. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new responsibility. Carthage, still licking the wounds of the First Punic War, needed a leader to keep alive the flame of resistance against Rome. Hannibal, however, was not yet ready to assume command. That role fell into the hands of Hasdrubal the Fair, Hannibal's brother-in-law, and a brilliant strategist who continued to expand Carthaginian influence in the Iberian Peninsula. Imagine Hannibal, now a young man with piercing eyes and a body hardened by years of military training, serving under Hasdrubal. He was not merely an observer. He was a voracious apprentice, riding alongside warriors, learning to negotiate with tribal chieftains, and commanding men in battles against peoples such as the Olcades and the Vaccii. Hispania was a chessboard, and every move had to be calculated. Fragile alliances with local tribes, silver mines, filling Carthage's coffers, and the constant tension with Rome, which observed from afar. In 226 before Christ, Hasdrubal signed a treaty with the Romans, promising not to cross the Ebro River with armies, an attempt to maintain peace while Carthage grew stronger. Hannibal, with his sharp mind, absorbed everything: the victories, the negotiations, and the delicate balance of power. Then, in 221 before Christ, tragedy struck again. Hasdrubal was assassinated, the victim of treachery that shook the Carthaginian army. At only 26 years of age, Hannibal found himself at the center of a storm. The soldiers, who saw him as the natural heir of Hamilcar, unanimously chose him as their new commander. The government of Carthage, recognizing his skill and charisma, confirmed the choice. Imagine the scene: a young man, the weight of an oath made at 9 years old still burning in his chest, taking command of thousands of men: Carthaginians, Iberians, Numidians, all looking to him for leadership. Hannibal did not hesitate. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of hope for a people humiliated by Rome. Under his command, Hispania turned into a cauldron of conquest. Hannibal led swift and brutal campaigns, subduing rebellious tribes with a mixture of diplomacy and force. He won battles, such as the one by the Tagus River, where he displayed his tactical brilliance, using the terrain and Numidian cavalry to crush his enemies. He married Emilce, an Iberian princess from the city of Castulo, sealing alliances with local tribes and strengthening his base of power. Each victory, each alliance, was a step toward transforming Hispania into a war machine capable of challenging Rome. But Hannibal knew that the true confrontation was yet to come. In 219 before Christ, Hannibal made a decision that would change the course of history. Saguntum, a coastal city south of the Ebro River, was an ally of Rome, yet it lay within territory Hannibal considered under Carthaginian influence. He saw in Saguntum an opportunity, or perhaps a provocation. Ignoring the treaty of 226 before Christ, Hannibal surrounded the city with his army. For 8 months, the walls of Saguntum resisted, while its inhabitants fought with desperation. Imagine the siege: catapults hurling stones, shields gleaming under the sun, and Hannibal, always present, inspiring his men with fierce determination. When Saguntum finally fell, devastated, Rome could no longer ignore the threat. The Eternal City declared war in 218 before Christ, beginning the Second Punic War, a conflict that would last 16 years and take Hannibal to the edges of the known world. Hannibal, now 29 years old, was ready. He gathered a colossal army, about 90,000 soldiers, 12,000 cavalry, and dozens of war elephants, and departed from Cartagena in Hispania toward Italy. His objective was not merely to avenge Carthage. It was to humiliate Rome in its own homeland. The oath he had sworn at 9 years old now echoed in every step of his march, and the world was about to witness the genius of one of the greatest strategists in history. In the year 218 before Christ, the world witnessed a feat that would echo through the centuries as one of the greatest military achievements in history. Hannibal Barca, at 29 years of age, was no longer merely a Carthaginian general. He was a force of nature, driven by an oath made in childhood and by the ambition to bring Rome to its knees. With an army of about 90,000 men, Carthaginian infantry, Numidian cavalry, Iberian mercenaries, and dozens of war elephants, he departed from Cartagena in Hispania, heading toward Italy. His plan was bold, almost impossible: to invade the heart of Roman territory by crossing the Alps, a mountain range so formidable that even the gods seemed hesitant to face it. What followed was a saga of courage, sacrifice, and tactical genius that transformed Hannibal into legend. The crossing of the Alps began in the autumn of 218 before Christ, when the first snows were already covering the peaks. Imagine the scene: an endless column of soldiers, horses, and elephants marching along narrow trails, with steep cliffs on one side and treacherous abysses on the other. The frozen air cut like blades, and the wind howled between the rocks. Hannibal led from the front, mounted on his horse, eyes fixed on the horizon, while his men faced hunger, cold, and the attacks of mountain tribes, such as the Allobroge, who saw the Carthaginians as invaders. The elephants, colossal creatures brought from Africa, were both a force and a challenge. Their heavy steps made trails collapse, and many fell into ravines or succumbed to the cold. For 15 days, the army endured snowstorms, landslides, and ambushes. Soldiers slipped on frozen paths. Supplies dwindled. Morale, when they finally descended into the plains of northern Italy, the cost was devastating. Of the 90,000 men and 40 elephants who had departed, only about 26,000 soldiers and a few elephants survived. Yet Hannibal was undaunted. He knew that surprise was his greatest weapon. The Romans, confident in their legions, had never expected an army to cross the Alps. And there, in the land of the Gauls, Hannibal found allies. Local tribes, resentful of Roman rule, joined him, renewing his strength. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change history. The first battle came at the end of 218 before Christ, on the banks of the river Ticinus. The Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the future Scipio Africanus, attempted to intercept Hannibal with his legions. But Hannibal, with his Numidian cavalry, agile horsemen who seemed to dance on horseback, flanked the Romans in a lightning ambush. Scipio was wounded, and his troops, disorganized, retreated. It was a small victory, but a clear sign. Rome was not prepared for what Hannibal brought. Weeks later, still in 218 before Christ, Hannibal faced a larger Roman army at the river Trebia. In the freezing December mist, he devised a masterstroke. He concealed part of his cavalry and infantry in bushes along the riverbank, luring the Romans into a trap. The legionaries, exhausted and hungry after crossing the icy river, were caught off guard. Hannibal's cavalry struck from the flanks, while his hidden men emerged like phantoms. Thousands of Romans fell, and northern Italy fell under Hannibal's control. Rome trembled, but the worst was yet to come. In 217 before Christ, Hannibal raised his campaign to a new level. At Lake Trasimene, he orchestrated one of the greatest ambushes in military history. Knowing that the consul Gaius Flaminius was pursuing him, Hannibal chose a narrow defile along the lakeshore, where the morning fog concealed his troops. When the Romans marched through, confident, they were surrounded on all sides. In only a few hours, 15,000 Roman soldiers, including Flaminius, were slain. The fog turned crimson, and the lake became a symbol of the terror Hannibal inspired. He did not march directly on Rome. His forces were exhausted, and he needed allies. But his presence in Italy was like a shadow that devoured Roman confidence. The pinnacle came in 216 before Christ, at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's masterpiece, facing a Roman army of nearly 80,000 men, led by the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Hannibal commanded only about 50,000 soldiers, but he did not need numbers. He had genius. On the open plain, he deployed his troops in a crescent formation, with a deliberately weaker center advancing and stronger flanks withdrawing. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, pushed into the center, only to be enveloped by Hannibal's flanks in a perfect pincer movement. The Numidian cavalry sealed the encirclement, cutting off every escape. The result was a massacre. About 44,000 Romans were slain in a single day, one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. Cities in southern Italy, such as Capua, defected to Hannibal, and even Philip V of Macedon sent envoys to form alliances. Hannibal was at his height. His victories were not merely battles won. They were demonstrations of intelligence, courage, and leadership. He had crossed impossible mountains, united divided peoples, and challenged Rome's power on its own soil. But even after Cannae, the war was far from over. Rome, wounded but unbroken, refused to surrender, and Hannibal, without the resources to besiege the capital, faced an uncertain future. Still, in that moment, he was the master of the battlefield, a name that thundered in the hearts of Romans. In the year 216 before Christ, Following the devastating victory at Cannae, Hannibal Barca seemed invincible. The plains of Italy trembled beneath his feet, and entire cities, such as Capua and Tarentum, abandoned Rome to join the Carthaginian general. He had humiliated the greatest empire in the world, destroying armies with tactical genius that seemed to defy the gods. But, like a storm that loses strength as it moves away from the sea, Hannibal's campaign began to weaken. What had begun as a triumphant march toward the glory of Carthage would end in the year 202 before Christ, in the dust of Zama, where the fate of Hannibal and his nation would be sealed by a young Roman general named Scipio Africanus. The years following Cannae were a test of endurance. Hannibal, now in his early 30s, remained in Italy, but the war became a game of patience. Rome, wounded, adopted the strategy of Fabius Maximus, the delayer, avoiding direct confrontations and gradually wearing down Hannibal's forces. Without the resources to besiege the Roman capital and with scarce supplies, he relied on local allies. Alliances that began to crumble. Cities that had deserted to his side, such as Capua, were retaken by Rome, which employed brutal tactics to punish traitors. In 207 before Christ, a devastating blow came with the Battle of the Metaurus. Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, had crossed the Alps with an army to reinforce him, but he was intercepted and defeated. In a cruel gesture, the Romans sent Hasdrubal's head to Hannibal's camp, a grim reminder that the tide was turning. Imagine the impact. Hannibal, the man who had made Rome tremble, now facing the solitude of a leader without support, burdened by the loss of his brother. Meanwhile, Rome found a new hero, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus. Scipio, who had faced Hannibal at the river Ticinus and learned from his defeats, emerged as a brilliant strategist. Instead of pursuing Hannibal in Italy, he took the war to Hispania, capturing Cartagena in 209 before Christ and destroying Carthaginian control in the region. Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics, adopting his flexibility and daring. In 204 before Christ, he landed in Africa, directly threatening Carthage. The city's walls, which Hannibal had sworn to protect, now trembled under Rome's shadow. The Carthaginian government, desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy in 203 before Christ, after 15 years of campaigning. He left the peninsula with a heavy heart, knowing that his dream of destroying Rome on its own soil had slipped away. Hannibal returned to Carthage as a stranger in his own land. At 45 years of age, he was no longer the impetuous youth who had crossed the Alps. He was a hardened veteran, yet still driven by the oath of his childhood. In 202 before Christ, on the plains of Zama, about 160 kilometers from Carthage, he faced Scipio in a battle that would determine the fate of two civilizations. Hannibal commanded approximately 40,000 men, including 80 war elephants, but his army was a shadow of its former self. Many were inexperienced recruits, and his Numidian allies, once loyal, had switched sides to Rome, enticed by Scipio's promises. On the other side, Scipio led a disciplined Roman army, reinforced by Numidian cavalry under the command of King Massinissa. The battle began with the thunder of Hannibal's elephants, launched against the Roman lines. But Scipio, well aware of Hannibal's tactics, had prepared a trap. His legions opened corridors in their formations, allowing the elephants to pass through harmlessly while being attacked on the flanks. What followed was a brutal confrontation. Hannibal attempted to replicate his Cannae tactic, weakening his center to envelop the Romans. But Scipio had learned well. He held his lines firm and used the Numidian cavalry to flank the Carthaginian forces. The encirclement closed, and Hannibal's army, exhausted and overwhelmed, collapsed. Approximately 20,000 Carthaginians were killed, while Hannibal narrowly escaped, riding away with the few survivors. The defeated Zama was more than a lost battle. It was the end of the Second Punic War and of Carthage's hope. Hannibal, the man who had challenged Rome for nearly 2 decades, saw his nation forced to accept humiliating terms: the surrender of its fleet, the loss of territories in Hispania and the Mediterranean, and the payment of heavy indemnities that would crush the Carthaginian economy for generations. Yet Hannibal did not succumb to despair. He returned to Carthage as a defeated leader, but determined to save his city from collapse. The Battle of Zama marked the end of his military campaign, but not of his legend. Even in defeat, Hannibal remained a feared and admired figure, a general whose audacity had almost changed the course of history. In the year 202 before Christ, following the devastating defeat at Zama, Hannibal Barca returned to Carthage, not as the conqueror he had dreamed of being, but as a defeated general, carrying the weight of an oath he could not fulfill. The city he had sworn to protect was on its knees, humiliated by Rome, forced to cede territories, its fleet, and its dignity. Yet Hannibal, at the age of 45, was not a man to surrender to despair. His mind, sharp as the blade of a Numidian sword, turned toward reconstruction. He assumed a role of civil leadership as chief magistrate, or suffet, in Carthage, where he implemented bold reforms to ease the burden of the indemnities imposed by Rome. Imagine Hannibal, once a lord of war, now navigating the corridors of politics, reorganizing finances, combating corruption, and inspiring his people to lift their heads. For a moment, it seemed that Carthage might rise from the ashes under his leadership. But Hannibal's success was a threat. The Carthaginian nobility, envious and fearful of his power, conspired against him. In the year 195 before Christ, accusations of treason began to circulate. Whispers that Hannibal was planning a new war against Rome. Whether true or not mattered little. Rome, always vigilant, demanded his capture. Hannibal, knowing that Carthage could not protect him without provoking Roman wrath, made a painful choice. He abandoned his city, his home, the land for which he had fought for decades, and departed into exile. Imagine the weight of that moment. A man who had crossed the Alps, who had made Rome tremble, now fleeing in the shadows, a fugitive in a world he had helped shape. Hannibal's exile was an odyssey of resistance. He sought refuge in the east, where Hellenistic kingdoms still challenged Rome's growing dominion. First, he found shelter at the court of Antiochus III, king of the Seleucid Empire, an ambitious monarch who dreamed of restraining Rome. Hannibal, with his unparalleled experience, became a military advisor. He suggested strategies, planned campaigns, and sought to rekindle the flame of resistance against the enemy he had never ceased to hate. In 190 before Christ, he advised Antiochus during the Battle of Magnesia, but the Seleucid defeat by Rome was a blow. Hannibal, realizing that his host could not protect him, fled once more, always a step ahead of the Roman envoys who pursued him like hunting dogs. His journey led him to distant lands, from Crete to small kingdoms in Asia Minor. Finally, in 189 before Christ, Hannibal found refuge in Bithynia, under the protection of King Prusius I. Even there, far from Carthage, he did not rest. As an admiral, he led the Bithynian fleet against Rhodes, an ally of Rome, in naval battles which, although smaller, demonstrated that his tactical genius still shone. But Rome was relentless. Its envoys tracked Hannibal to Bithynia, pressuring Prusius to surrender him. Betrayed by the king who had taken him in, Hannibal, now about 64 years old, found himself trapped in a fortress at Labissa, on the shores of the Sea of Marmara. In the year 183 before Christ, with the Romans at his door, Hannibal's journey came to an end. His death did not erase his legacy. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of resistance, a strategist whose brilliance in battles such as Cannae is still studied in military academies. Historians such as Polybius and Livy, despite their Roman biases, preserved his story, portraying him as a formidable adversary, a man who for nearly 2 decades made Rome fear for its very existence.